What led to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints ending a policy of racial restriction that had been in place for over a century? A couple weeks ago, I did a video talking about Official Declaration 1, where the LDS Church announced in 1890 that they were stopping polygamy, although, spoiler, polygamy did not stop in 1890. So for this week, I thought I'd do a deep dive on the second major proclamation the church did, ending what had been considered a core doctrine in 1978 when they issued what came to be known as Official Declaration 2 that ended the church's racial restriction. I'm going to break this down into several sections. First, I'll talk about a brief overview of the origins and key terms. Then I'll talk about four major influences that brought the racial restriction to an end. I'll be talking about potential African converts. I'll be talking about African American agitation at home. I'll be talking about new scholarship, and then I'll talk about developments in Brazil, which was really the major impetus. I'll also very briefly touch up on the lasting legacies and why this story still matters for Mormonism. But first, we need a bit of context, and I'm not going to go too deep into the origins of this racial restriction. Maybe I'll do a video in the future where I focus on it because it's a fascinating and often sobering story. But the brief gist is that Mormonism, for its first 2 decades, had a qualified universalism when it came to race. That there were some ideas that were directly drawn from the white supremacist culture out of which Mormonism was born, but they also had a number of policies and theologies that granted a bit more of a liminal space on religion. Joseph Smith, the founding prophet, enabled several Black men to be ordained to the priesthood. They did not segregate their worship services, and so there seemed to be a potential for racial integration. So that's why I call it a qualified universalism. All of that changes, however, over a course of a few years. And in 1852, Brigham Young, who is recognized as the second prophet of the LDS tradition, announced over the podium at a Utah territorial legislative session that there was a curse placed on those of African descent. Now, again, I'll go into more detail on this in a future video, but there are two driving factors, if I were to summarize a lot of broader complications, that led to Brigham Young reversing the church's stance on racial inclusion. First, and perhaps most prominently, there was a fear of interracial sex. And if they had interracial priesthood ordination, then that would lead to Black men marrying white women, and that seemed beyond the pale. And it was probably the case of one particular interracial couple out in Boston that sparked Brigham Young's reversal. And second, the racial restriction was announced in the context of Brigham Young and other Utah political leaders who were also ecclesiastical officers debating slavery. And so that racial restriction was tethered to how Brigham Young understood a racial order of things that was rooted in an anti-Black white supremacist theology. Now, it's important to note that that racial policy did not become fully formalized until 1908. And by that, I mean that there were still questions on who was impacted. How far did the policy go? Do we need a formal written down thing in the handbook, so to speak? And the fact that when the church was growing in America in the first few years of the 20th century, they didn't know whether Black converts could be ordained to the lower priesthood, could they participate in Sunday school? And it wasn't until 1908 when Joseph F. Smith, who was then the prophet, formalized that racial restriction. And then they forgot the original qualified universalism of previous Mormonism. So that's a general overview of the origins. Let me also talk very quickly about terms that I'm using. You'll often hear this policy referred to as the priesthood ban. The reason why that terminology is problematic is because if you just speak of it as the priesthood ban, you're only talking about the men who were affected, and the men with African ancestry were denied ordination to the priesthood and were unable to hold priesthood office. However, However, men weren't the only people affected. Women with African ancestry were also denied entrance to the temple and the ability to participate in temple rituals. Some people therefore get around it by calling it the temple and priesthood ban, and I understand that. That's a bit of a mouthful. I think the more succinct term and one that captures the overall policy and mindset is racial restriction, which is why that's the term I use here. By the way, if you enjoy and appreciate this type of analysis in which Mormon and religious and American culture is placed within the broader historical context and that help us better understand how we got here, please subscribe to this channel and please like the video so the algorithm knows that this is a video that people want to see. Also on my channel, you can see previous videos I've done on the LDS Church's recent Gospel Topics Q&A page on the church and race, as well as a video on BYU athletics and how that fit into the racial protests of the 1960s and 1970s. And further, I have written a book, American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, which is a general survey of the faith in which race and racism is a key theme. So once the policy of racial restriction was formalized in 1908, there went several decades where it became further entrenched within the tradition, even while many in the faith did not know it existed, because many Mormons operated in racially segregated society, and they did not really have to confront issues of racial equality, like many white Americans who ignored the plight of the African Americans who were being marginalized. This began to change in the 1940s and 1950s, both at home, which I'll talk about in a bit, but also abroad, because starting the late 1940s, church leadership started receiving correspondence from potential converts in West Africa. A number of large communities, including some quasi-congregations, had somehow learned about the Mormon message, and they wrote the LDS Church to send missionaries and formally establish the church there. Now, here's an image of one of those early communities. Now, that situation flummoxed LDS leaders because they did not quite know what to do. They believed the racial restriction was divinely appointed, and therefore they did not want to overturn that revelatory policy. Some raised the question of ordaining black men to the Aaronic priesthood. Maybe the lesser priesthood is something they can do so they can at least function as a religion. And they also started exploring possibilities of sending missionaries out there. And there were some missionaries assigned to go out to West Africa and at least explore the possibilities. But problems soon arose. It became a national scandal when news crept out about these African potential converts and the church deciding what to do. And that prompted many in the media to recognize what was the LDS Church's racial policy. And so that became a big deal. And second, Latter-day Saint leaders in Salt Lake City worried that if we convert these black African converts, they join the LDS faith, some might migrate to America. What happens if some of those black men start sleeping with white women? This was a fear that constantly came up in the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 discussions whenever they debated allowing African converts. So by the early 1960s, the church decided it was not worth the effort, so they closed all potential discussions of an African mission. But what they did do was they started questioning, well, maybe we can restrict who is actually affected. David O. McKay, who was the LDS president at the time, he announced in the 1950s and 1960s that he was reducing the number of nations and lineages that were affected by the racial restriction. For instance, he announced that those who lived in the Polynesian islands were not descendants of Ham and were not African descendants, and therefore they were not affected by the racial restriction. So the number of those who were directly inclined to be part of the racial policy started to restrict, and church leaders started asking questions of what can we do further. More agitation started expanding in America, especially in the 1960s, when the civil rights movement prompted many to ask questions of racial subjugation and oppression, including in Utah. The NAACP started targeting the LDS Church as an embodiment of the racial oppression that African Americans faced in America. In fact, in 1963, the NAACP threatened to protest at the LDS General Conference at October, and only held off when Hugh B. Brown, a member of the First Presidency, agreed to read out a First Presidency statement that reaffirmed, while we believe in this racial restriction policy that has been instituted by God's revelatory command, we do support civil rights measures. And that seemed to satiate the protesters, at least for a bit, but not for long, because by 1965, there are actually worries and conspiracies of race riots taking place around the LDS General Conference. And later on that decade, you get a number of protests against BYU athletic teams on campuses that were the hotbed of civil rights protests, a topic of a previous video I have done. And there are also a growing, albeit still small, number of Black Latter-day Saint converts who were urging the church to reconsider their racial restriction. And in 1970, a group of those Black men met and organized the Genesis Group, a group that hoped to provide support for other Black converts, as well as to respectfully and very reverently petition the church to reconsider its racial policies. Among those Genesis Group members were Darius Gray, who is one of my personal heroes, who would commence a career-long effort to improve the experiences of Black Latter-day Saints. And that worked. That caused a lot of Latter-day Saint leaders to question things that they had long taken for granted. Again, David O. McKay, who was the church president at the time, started raising questions of maybe it's just a policy and not a doctrine. Maybe it's time to overturn it. And at one point in the early 1950s, he commissioned a group to study the origins of the racial restriction, and that study concluded that they were human in origin and it could be reversed. But there was opposition within the Quorum of the 12 to overturn it. Then once again, in the late 1960s, there was another push to grant Black men at least the Aaronic priesthood that was only overturned when some of the more conservative members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, like Harold B. Lee, opposed it. If you want to know more about these fascinating internal debates, I strongly recommend Matthew Harris's book, Second Class Saints, published by Oxford University Press last year. One of the things or ideas that the LDS Church clung to in the face of this internal and external opposition was the idea that Joseph Smith started the practice and therefore it had to remain in place. But that idea began to be challenged in the early 1970s. A military doctor and amateur historian by the name of Lester Bush began digging into that history and realized that it was a product of Brigham Young and later cultural circumstances. The result of his years-long investigation was a massively influential and important article published in the journal Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, titled Mormonism's Negro Doctrine and Historical Overview, published in their 1973 issue. This article, it would be hard to overstate the significance because it undercut traditional dogmatic understandings of where the racial restriction policy came from and reaffirmed that it was human in origins, which seemed to imply that it can be overturned easily. There's a wonderful anecdote of some of the more conservative members who rejected it, including the apostle Bruce R. McConkie, who someone alleged that when they walked in his office and he was caught reading the article, he slammed it on the desk, punched his fist down, and goes, "Crap!" if you're curious what his opinion was. But it did, again, raise questions of if this were just a policy rather than a doctrine, maybe it could be turned around and rescinded for the new age. But while I, as a historian, would love to say it was the historical work that proved the primary thing to overturn the racial restriction, that'd be a lie and exaggeration. The major impulse or influence that led church leaders to overturn the racial restriction was Brazil. And by that I mean in the 1960s and 70s, the LDS Church experienced a massive explosion of converts in Central and South America, including in Brazil. That seemed to be where the future of the faith was because that's where many of the converts were. But Brazil posed a complicated problem for the LDS Church. Because of its mixed racial history tied up in the legacies of slavery and colonialism, many of these converts in Brazil likely had traces of African ancestry, and none of them could prove one way or another. And the church tried to overcome it. In fact, there was an embedded missionary lesson. Those of you who might have served in LDS mission, you remember the lessons that you would get. A lesson that was made specifically for the Brazil mission would teach potential converts how to research their genealogy and determine whether they had any African ancestry. And they were committed, as one of the questions that they had to commit to before baptism would be that they would alert the authorities if they ever determined that they had African ancestry. That's a lot to ask of them. And church leaders recognized that it was increasingly difficult for a growing and international faith to maintain such a segregationist policy in a world where segregation was becoming impossible. And so when Spencer W. Kimball, who was the LDS prophet starting in the 1970s, announced in 1975 that there would be a temple built in Brazil, that was, for all intents and purposes, the granting of an expiration date on the racial restriction, because there was no way a temple would be able to operate in Brazil if that racial restriction were still in place. So that brings us to 1978. The prophet at the time, like I mentioned, was Spencer W. Kimball, a prophet who is known for his humility and his nuances in approaching racial issues. He had been raised in Arizona and had dealt a lot with the Native American population, and in fact, trying to reach out to what they called the Lamanites, a topic for another video, was a driving focus. He had also expressed private discomfort with the racial policy. In fact, in one letter to a son in the 1960s, he raised the possibility that the racial policy was an error, and he prayed that church leaders would be able to repent of their ways so that they could overturn it. And by the 1970s, due to external agitation, internal pressures, new scholarship, and now the question of Brazil, he tries to explore the topic further. He assigns an apostolic committee to investigate whether there are truly historic and scriptural foundations for the policy, and it appears by 1977 that he was now convinced that the racial policy had to be overturned. But he also was convinced that there had to be unanimous support among the quorum of the 12 apostles and the First Presidency, the top levels of the LDS Church, in order for that policy to be reversed. So he started working with some of the more hesitant, reluctant, and conservative apostles, and by the spring of 1978, he felt he had them all on board. So he approached the First Presidency in May, and they all signed on. And then he approached the Quorum of the 12 after he had done legwork with a lot of them. And the two remaining apostles, who seemed to be holdouts on the racial issues, who had been outspoken on the racial restrictions, saying we will never change it, Delbert Stapley, as well as Mark Peterson, they were not at the Quorum of the 12 meeting. One was in South America on a mission, and the other was in the hospital. So Spencer W. Kimball knew how to play the politics. They then came to a conclusion, issue the official declaration number 2 that was announced to the media on June 8, 1978, saying that the church would no longer be restricting on the basis of race to priesthood ordination or temple rituals. A few thoughts on the lasting legacies. The LDS Church, and especially the leaders, hoped that issuing the declaration would be the last of it, and that it would speak for itself and they would never have to say another word. However, the racism that had led to the creation and perpetuation of the policy, it did not just disappear overnight. And the church had to continually find ways to speak out against lingering racism, even while the church embodied some of those anti-Black racist practices. Most importantly, church leaders did not want to directly refute past leader teachings and prophetic pronouncements and the divine idea of the restriction in the first place, because in showing the fallibility of past prophets on this issue, it might undercut present prophetic infallibility on other topics. This is why so many people bring up the issue of the racial restriction when discussing things like same-sex marriage or LGBTQ saints, with those arguing for change, saying here's the precedent of the church evolving, and church leaders responding saying, A, it's different, and B, we don't want to give up past prophetic authority because we know that would undercut our own authority in the present. This is why the topic remains relevant, because it's another story about how Mormonism, just like any other religion, is rooted in its particular culture, but a acknowledgement of that rootedness, of that contextual status, is only going to raise further questions and lead for more agitation. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like it so that I know it's receiving a good reception. Share it with friends who might enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And also check out the other videos I've done on this similar topic, whether it be my video on BYU athletics and the protests of the 1960s and 70s, or my video on the church's recent Gospel Topics Q&A page, which is the most recent attempt by the church to confront this lasting legacy.